Namaste everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today's opponent ranking is 1145. Let's play. Pawn e1, opponent's pawn d5, pawn d3, opponent move pawn d2. I move bishop at d2. Opponent moves his bishop at d7. I move my bishop at c3. Opponent moved his knight at f6. I move my knight at f3. Opponent moved pawn at e6. I move my bishop at e2. Opponent moves its pawn at b6. I move my knight at d2. Opponent moves his knight at d7. I move my bishop at f3. Opponent moved pawn at c6. I move my knight at b3. Opponent moves his pawn at a6. I move my knight at d4. Opponent moves its bishop at b7. I move my knight at b3. Opponent moves castles. I also castles. Opponent moved his pawn at a5. I move my pawn at g3. Opponent moved his queen at c7. I move my bishop at g2. Opponent moved its pawn at a4. I move my knight at d2. Opponent moves its pawn at c5. I move my knight at f3. Opponent moves its pawn at b5. I move my pawn at a3. Opponent moves its pawn at d4. I takes opponent's pawn at d4. I takes opponent's pawn at d4 with bishop at d. Opponent moves its queen at d6. I move my bishop at c3. Opponent moves its knight at d5. I takes opponent's bishop at g7. Opponent takes my bishop at g7. I move my knight at c3. Opponent moves its pawn at b4. I takes opponent knight at d5. Opponent captures my knight at d5. I move my knight at d2. Opponent captures my bishop at g2 with its bishop. I takes opponent bishop at g2. Opponent moves its knight at e5. I move my king at g1. Opponent takes my pawn at a3. I takes opponent pawn at a3. Opponent move its queen at d4. I move my knight at f3. Opponent takes my knight at f3. I takes opponent knight at f3. Opponent moves its rook at c8. I move my pawn at c4. Opponent moves its rook at d8. I move my rook at d1. Opponent moves it queen at c3. I move my king at g2. Opponent moves at c2. I move my queen at e4. Opponent moves its rook at d7. I move my queen at a5. Opponent moves its king at g8. I move my rook at c1. Opponent moves its queen at b3. I move my rook at a1. Opponent takes my pawn at c4. I captures opponent's pawn at c4. Opponent captures my rook at d1. I captures opponent's rook at d1. Opponent's queen takes my rook at d1. I move my queen at b5. Opponent moves its queen at c2. I move my queen at b4. Opponent moves its queen at c4 with check on king. I move my king at g1. Opponent moves its queen at ce6. I move my king at f1. Opponent moves its pawn at c5. I move my pawn at h4. Opponent moves his pawn at s5. I move my pawn at c5. Opponent moves its queen f6. I move my queen at b5. Opponent moves queen at h1. I may move my king at e2. Opponent move its queen at e4. I move my king at f1. Opponent moves at d3 with check. I move my king at g2. Opponent takes my pawn. I move my pawn at c4. Opponent moves its queen at d6. I move my queen at b7 with check. Opponent moves its king at f6. I move my pawn at c7. Opponent moves its pawn at a3. I converts my pawn into queen at c8. Opponent moves its pawn at a2. I move my queen at b2 with check. Opponent moves its pawn. I move my queen at a8 and opponent surrenders.